Hey, Satenico here once again for God Loves Comics. In 2010, Stan Lee was videotaped for a deposition in the case of Jack Kirby's estate versus Marvel Comics. The Kirby estate was suing for the rights to the Fantastic Four, the X-Men, Thor, and most amazingly, Spider-Man. Obviously, Kirby was integral to the first three titles, but his contributions to Spider-Man were highly dubious at best. You essentially have the Kirby estate and vociferous Kirby acolytes such as Mark Evanier, who was a longtime assistant of Kirby and I think a biographer, and John Morrow, publisher of the Jack Kirby Collector, claiming that Kirby was screwed out of the rights to characters he created. But in the process, also attempting to claim a character created by Stan Lee and Steve Ditko, which would seem wildly hypocritical at best. It is worth noting that Disney had purchased Marvel in 2009 for $4 billion, meaning that the families of any former creators surely did not expect Disney to just hand over their copyrights, but instead likely hoped that Disney would reach a settlement, perhaps to avoid bad press, or that a sympathetic judge may side with the families for some percentage of future MCU profits. Stan Lee is not remotely the villain here. He is not appearing as an executive of Disney nor of Marvel, but instead an affable figurehead who Marvel realized was too important as the face of the company to simply cast aside, as they have with less famous creators, including Kirby. Lee was merely a former intern at Timely Comics. In fact, he ran errands for Joe Simon and Jack Kirby as a teenager and later became a co-creator alongside Kirby and/or Ditko on all of the aforementioned titles, and then became a tireless editor and chief at Marvel Comics. Here he found himself at the age of 87 being asked to remember minor details of his work at Marvel dating back as much as half a century or more. How good is your grandfather's memory? How good is yours? In truth, almost none of Marvel's legendary stable of characters was a wildly original creation with no precedent in the decades that preceded the Marvel age of the 1960s. That means that neither Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, nor Steve Ditko created any of these characters whole cloth, but more of that in an upcoming video. One final caveat before I read the testimony. Stan Lee is such an indelible and iconic voice that it's impossible to read any quote from Stan without hearing his voice in your head. Now, I do not want to attempt a Stan impersonation here, but admittedly, when reading Stan's testimony, I probably add a little extra sauce to my voice, which is both unavoidable and helpful in distinguishing Lee's responses from the lawyer's questions. I have not read this yet, so expect me to fumble around a bit at times, especially in discerning exactly who is talking. So, for the record, Mr. Quinn is acting for Marvel, and Mr. Toberoff is acting on the behalf of the estate of the Kirbys. And Mr. Quinn opens by asking Stan Lee where he has been educated. Stan Lee, DeWitt Clinton High School, and that's about the extent of it. Mr. Quinn, and when did you graduate from DeWitt Clinton High School? You know, honest to God, I don't remember the year, but I did graduate. Fair enough. And did you serve in the military? Yes, I was in the U.S. Army Signal Corps in World War II. And how long were you in the military? 3 years. Could you briefly, or as briefly as you can, tell us your employment history after you left DeWitt Clinton High School? Well, I had a lot of different jobs. I wrote obituaries for a press service. I was an office boy. I was an usher. I did some advertising for the National Jewish Hospital at Denver. I never knew what was supposed to be advertising, whether telling people to get sick to go to the hospital. I finally got a job at a place called Timely Comics, which published comic books. And approximately when was that? The late 1930s? 1940s? I think it must have been 1939, 1940, somewhere around there. And what was your first job responsibility at Timely? Well, I was hired by two people, Joe Simon and Jack Kirby, who were producing the comics at the time for this company, which was called Timely Comics. And my job was really to be an assistant. I went down and I got them their lunch sandwiches for them, and I filled their... In those days, they dipped the brushes in ink and used pencil sharpeners. I sharpened the pencils. I erased the pages after they finished. I did whatever an assistant or an office boy would do. And at the time, who was running or owned Timely? The company was owned by a man named Martin Goodman. He was a publisher? Yes. And is Timely a predecessor, or did Timely eventually become what we know as Marvel? There's a break in the testimony, and then Mr. Quinn comes back. Mr. Lee, you mentioned just a few minutes ago, before we took our short break, that you had started as, I guess, an apprentice effectively at Timely Marvel around 1940. Did there come a time that you got a promotion? Yes. Tell us how that occurred. Joe Simon and Jack Kirby were really the only two people there producing the comics, and for some reason they left. I was the only guy left in the department. So Martin asked me if I could sort of function as an editor and art director and writer until he hired someone as, a grown-up. I said, sure. When you're 18 years old, what do you know? I said, sure, I can do it. And I think he forgot to hire a grown-up because I was there ever since. Right, 60 years later, they still haven't hired a grown-up. I'm still waiting. But you had grown up. Now, did you have an understanding at the time, or did you come to have an understanding as to why Simon and Kirby were let go? I didn't know at the time, but I have heard much later from a number of different people that had something to do with, well, they were supposed to have been working exclusively for Martin Goodman. And he found out that they had, had been doing some work for some other company, something like that. And he fired them in effect. I guess, yeah. Now, when you became the editor, what were your job responsibilities? Well, I was writing a lot of stories, and I also would hire different artists to draw the stories, artists, letterers, inkers, so forth. And was it your responsibility to hire the writers and other artists and inkers and so forth and give them assignments? Yes. With regard to what they were going to actually be doing, yes. Objection from Mr. Toberoff, leading. Back to Mr. Quinn. And who oversaw? Tell us a little bit about how that assignment process worked, Stan Lee. Well, it was my job to dream up new characters, or to continue with the characters who we had and to pick the best artists and best writers unless I wrote something I had the privilege, which now, when I think back, it was rare. But I could either write stories myself or I could hire writers. I couldn't write everything. It was my job to hire the artists to draw the stories, and I did that for quite a number of years. And did you give instructions to the artist as to how you wanted a story to go? Oh, yes. That was my job as art director. So in addition to writing, you were also the art director. Yes. Now, who oversaw? Whose responsibility was the creative editorial aspects of the comics books that were being created? Well, the responsibility was mine because I had to answer to the publisher, Martin Goodman, and he had to be happy with what I was doing. Did you have the ability to not only make assignments, but also to edit and change things that other writers or artists were doing in connection with the comics? Yeah, that was my job. If, for example, I saw some artwork and I felt there wasn't enough action on the page or it was confusing, the reader might not know what it was. Or in a script, if I felt there was too much dialogue or too little dialogue, it was up to me to make stories as good as I could make them. Now, you mentioned that you did perform services, not only as an editor, but also as a writer. Did you consider the services you performed as a writer part of your duties as the editor, or something additional? Well, I never thought of it that way. I was the editor, I was the art director, I was also a staff writer. And how were you paid in connection with the work that you did? How was I paid? How were you paid in connection with the work as an editor and as a writer? I received a salary which was paid to me as editor and art director, but I got paid on a freelance basis for the stories that I wrote. And when you say you were paid on a freelance basis, how were you paid? On what basis? Same as every other writer. I was paid per page, so much money per page of a script. There was a fixed amount of money? Yes. For each page? Yes. And was there a policy, or did you have a policy to pay writers and artists on that per page rate, whether or not the page was actually used or published? Oh, yes. Even if we didn't publish it, if an artist drew a 10-page story and the artist rate was $20 a page, I would put in a voucher for $200 for that artist. Now, and this happened rarely, but if we decided not to use that story, the artist would still keep the money because he had done the work. It wasn't his fault. And that's the way it was. Everybody was paid per page. Now, you mentioned that you had the right to edit and make changes. Was there anyone else in addition to you who had the right to edit and make changes? Yes. In the work, who was that? Oh, my boss, Martin Goodman. Though he really didn't edit. He would just call me into his office and say, "Gee, Stan, I didn't like this story. I didn't think it was good. Do a better one next time. Maybe it needs a new writer. Maybe it needs a new artist." Things like that. But I did the actual detail work. Were there times where Mr. Goodman would tell you that he didn't want something to be done a certain way? Yeah. And you changed? Yeah. There were. Not that often, but yes. But that was your understanding of how the process worked. Oh, absolutely. He was the ultimate boss. And did he have final say on what was published back in the 1950s and 60s? Yes, as long as he was a publisher, he did. Did Mr. Goodman ever edit any of your work? Well, not too often, except every so often he'd say, "I think you're putting in too much dialogue. I don't think the readers want to read that much." I was always disagreed with him, but I would sneak in as much dialogue as I could. Now, was this pretty much the practice that existed at Marvel, beginning when you started as editor in the 1940s and then up through the time that you became the publisher in the late 1960s? Mr. Toberoff, vague and ambiguous. Back to Quinn. You can answer. Stan Lee, yes. And did this process of assignment and so forth come to be known as the Marvel method? Oh, no. The Marvel method referred to something else. Okay, why don't you describe the Marvel method? There was a time when I was writing so many stories that I couldn't keep up with the artists. I couldn't feed them enough work. And you see, the artists were freelancers. So, for example, if Jack was working on a story and Steve was waiting for me to give him a story because he had finished what he had been doing, Jack being Jack Kirby? Jack Kirby. And Steve Ditko? Right. Or it could have been any of the artists, but just using them as an example. If one of them was waiting for a story while I was finishing writing the story for the other one, I couldn't keep them waiting because he wasn't making money. He was a freelancer. He wasn't on salary. So I would say, "Look, Steve, I don't have time to write the script for you, and this is the idea for the story. I'd like this fill in, I'd like this to happen, and in the end, the hero ends by doing this. You go ahead and draw it any way you want, as long as you keep the main theme. I will keep finishing Jack's story. And when you finish drawing this one, I will put in all the dialogue and captions." So in that way, I could keep one artist working while I was filling in, finishing something for another artist. That worked out so well that I began doing it with just about all the artists. I would just give them an idea for a story, let them draw it any way they wanted to, because no matter how they drew it, even if they didn't do it as well as I might have wanted, I was conceited enough to think that I could fix it by the way I put the dialogue and the captions in. And I'd make sense out of it, even if they had done something wrong. I was able to keep a lot of artists busy at the same time by using that system, and I've never given that long of an explanation before. Did you end up using that system, and when did it come into play? In the 1950s and 60s approximately? Probably the 50s. During that time, you were the editor. I was always the editor. Until the late 1960s when you became publisher. Right. And in that process, did you always maintain the ability to edit and make changes or reject what the other writers or artists had created? Oh, sure. And did you do that on a regular basis? If something had to be rejected, sure. And that would include artwork that was done by, for example, Jack Kirby. Yeah. And do you recall instances where that occurred? It's a strange thing. I didn't recall it. Recall those instances too well. But I was talking to John Romita once. He was one of our artists, and we were talking about whether I had ever rejected any pages. I said, sometimes I can't remember. He said, Stan, don't you remember? Sometimes if somebody wanted a job as an inker at our place, and an inker is somebody who goes over the pencil drawings with ink so that they can be reproduced better at the engraver. And he said, if we wanted to test an inker and see how good he'd be, we would take one of the pages of Jack's that you hadn't used and ask the inker to ink over them as samples. And I had forgotten about that, but John Romita, we were talking about that. It was a few years ago he told me that. And when you had that conversation with Mr. Romita, did that refresh your recollection that you had from time to time rejected pages from Jack Kirby? Yeah. Actually, probably less from Kirby than anybody else because he was so good. But I had. There were times when things had to be rejected for myriad reasons. Let me mark as Lee Exhibit Number 1 an affidavit. It is a document titled Affidavit of Stan Lee, and ask you to take a look at that. Mr. Toberoff. I would like to make a standing objection if you will agree, otherwise I have to make it. I totally disagree given the fact that you rejected over and over again our offer. But in any event, let's move on and save time. So that is a little bit of dispute between Toberoff, who is, of course, representing the Kirby estate, and Quinn, who is representing Marvel. Okay, now could you take a look at the last page of the document entitled Affidavit of Stan Lee? It's page 8 of the affidavit. Is that your signature? Yes. And have you had the opportunity in the last day or so to review this affidavit? I'd have to refresh my memory. So go ahead and refresh your recollection again. That's right. And having reviewed the affidavit, is there anything in the affidavit as far as you can tell that is inaccurate or wrong? No, I don't think so. It's all truthful? Yes. I'm just going to ask a couple of questions. Sure. About some of the things that are in the affidavit. You just testified a little while ago about the process that you utilized in connection with making assignments and so forth. And paragraphs, I guess 3 and 4 of this affidavit also describe the same methodology. In paragraph 4 of the affidavit, it reads that I will just read it and you can follow along. It says, quote, timely. That would be Marvel. Quote, however, always maintain the right to direct the storylines and the right to edit any aspect of the materials I submitted for publication, including the characteristics of any existing or new characters I utilize in the storylines, unquote. Now, would that also be true with regard to other writers and other artists? Stan Lee. Wait. Question. That Marvel maintained the right to direct the storylines. Oh, yes. The artist, it held for the artist and the writers and the letterers and the inkers and the colorists and everybody. And the next sentence says, at that time, it was typical in the industry for the comic book publishers to own the rights to the materials that were created for them for publication. Yes. And that was your understanding? Yes. At that time, yes. And that continued through the time that you stopped being the editor in the late 1960s. Yes. So that would include the period of the 1950s and 60s. Yes. And it further goes on to say that, and that would apply not only to things that you created, but also things that were created by other writers and other artists like Jack Kirby. Yes, that's right. And that was the understanding in the industry at the time. Yes, that was my understanding. And it goes on to say that Timely, referring to Marvel, quote, would own whatever rights existed to all of the materials I created or co-created for publication. That was your understanding. Yes, it was. And that was your understanding not only with regard to materials you created, but were created by other writers and artists who were working under your direction. Yes. And do you ever recollect going back during that period of time, any of the artists or writers disagreeing or telling you that they didn't agree with that? During this period of time, no. Now, in paragraph 11, there is a reference to a Schedule A that's attached to this affidavit. And it says that a list of some of the characters I created or co-created for Timely Marvel appears on Schedule A. And to the best of your knowledge, is that a list of some of the characters that you created or co-created? Yes. And looking at paragraph 13 of the affidavit, it states, I will read into the record, quote, for years I, being you, quote, received checks from Timely and its successor that bore a legend acknowledging that the payment was for works for hire, unquote. Do you recall that that's a true statement, right? Yes, it is. And do you recall that that was the practice at the time? Yes, it was. And was that the practice not only with the respect to you, but with all the writers and artists? Oh, yes. And that would include Mr. Kirby. Yes, everybody. Do you remember a woman who worked for Marvel back at a time by the name of Millie Sharif? There was a Millie. I think she was in bookkeeping department. I never knew her last name. I don't remember it. Lee Exhibit 2 is marked for identification. I'm going to mark an affidavit as Lee 2, and I'm just going to ask you a couple of questions about the affidavit. I'm going to point you to the paragraph 7, which is on the second page of the affidavit. And it says that Ms. Sharif says that, quote, all of the writing and drawing for the comic books was done on a work made for hire basis, unquote. That was your understanding. Yes. Consistent? And then it says in paragraph 8 that, quote, the work for hire language was affixed to each freelancer check by way of an ink stamp, unquote. Is that consistent with your recollection? Yes. Yes. Okay, that's all I have on that. Let me go back for a second to you mention the fact that the writers and artists during this period of time were paid on a per-page rate. That's right. And were different artists and different writers paid different rates? Oh, yes, according to how valuable we thought they were. And did it matter? Let's take a particular artist. Say Jack Kirby. Did it matter whether was Mr. Kirby one who got a higher page rate? Oh yeah, he got the highest page rate because I considered him our best artist. And with regard to his page rate, he got the page rate whether or not the actual drawings were ultimately published. Oh yes, most of them. They were practically all published. And yeah, I made sure he got the highest rate. Now, did it matter? He got the highest rate, but he got the same rate, whether it was a Fantastic Four or for the Hulk or in other words, he wasn't paid a different rate based on the characters. As far as I can remember, he wasn't paid a different rate. I wouldn't swear to it because I don't remember ever giving him a different rate. Let me put it that way. That's what I'm asking, your best recollection. Yes. That's your best recollection? Right. Now I'm going to ask you a few questions, general questions about the kind of creation of the comic book, and perhaps nobody knows it better than you. In general terms, and let's focus on the period between the 1950s and 60s, which is the relevant period in this case, I'd like you to tell us the role of the different contributors to each comic book. The writer, the artist, the penciler, the inker, the colorist, the letterer. What did each guy do or woman, if there were any? Marie Severin comes to mind, but that's about it. Stan Lee. Well, somebody has to come up with the idea of the script itself, and then it has to be written. For the first thing that happens is you either get a script by the writer, or in my case, you get an outline saying what the story is. Then it would go to the penciler, who would draw the script and in pencil. Then it would go to the letterer, who would letter the dialogue balloons and the captions in ink over the pencil drawings. Then it would go to the inker, who would ink the pencil drawings. So now the page had the lettering and the artwork done in ink so that we could go to the engraver and he could photograph it and whatever he did with it. Then in those days, we would get back from the engraver some sheets of paper, 8 by 10 usually, that were called silver prints. And there were silver print for each page. And they would go to the colorist, who would use some kind of aniline dye paints, and they would color the pages, which were then sent back to the engraver or the printer. I was never sure, but to tell that person how he wanted it colored when it was printed. The engraver and or the printer used those color sheets as a guide to, so they would know how to color the pages. Right, actually do the printing. And that's, I think that's all. There was the writer, the penciler, the letterer, the inker, the colorist. Of course, we had proofreaders, and sometimes we would make some changes. I, as the editor, would often look over a page and say, I don't like this drawing, let's fix it, or let's make this a long shot, not a close-up, and whatever I would do. I didn't do that too much because it cost us money and it wasted time, so only when it had to be done. Now, were all these people working in the same room? No. How did that work? No, usually the production people were the people who made the paste-ups. Right. But very often the artists worked at home. We did a lot of shipping things around. I would talk on the phone or in person to the artist I would type out an outline depending how we worked, and the artist usually went home and penciled it, bring it in to me, and I would approve or not approve of it and have what changes needed to be made. Then I would send it to the inker. We rarely had an inker who was really on staff. At a different address, the inker would do it and ship it back to me. If I liked it, usually it was okay, it would go on to the letterer. Now, often the letterers were on staff, but we also had a number of letterers who worked at home. In fact, our main letterers, Sam Rosen and Artie Simek, they both worked at home, so we would ship the artwork again. They would letter it, bring it back. We had a colorist who worked on staff, but we also had colorists who worked at home. So again, it was either done on staff or we shipped it. We were always moving and shipping things back and forth. There was no FedEx back then. No FedEx. No, it was very difficult. We had a small staff really in the office, usually one letterer who would make corrections on things, and sometimes one of the people also did the coloring. But mostly everything was done freelance and shipped around the city. Now, you mentioned all the different books involved, but you mentioned first somebody had to come up with the idea. Yeah. Was that your role for the most part? Pretty much, yeah. And after you would come up with the idea, how would you communicate the idea to the writer? Or in some cases, you were the writer, but a different writer or the artist. Well, we would meet. I would talk about it. I would usually often have something. I'd write out a brief outline of what the idea was. A synopsis. Or sometimes I would just talk it out with the artist. It really depended on how well I knew the artist, how well we worked together, how familiar we were with each other's style. Now, typically, who came up with the ideas for stories at Marvel during the 50s and 60s? Well, in the 50s and the early 50s, we were doing a lot of odd books. And very often, the writers of those odd books would come up with their own, although I did most of them. In the 60s, the ideas for the new characters originated with me, because that was my responsibility. And what would happen is the publisher Martin Goodman, for example, with the Fantastic Four, he called me into his office one day. He said, I understand that National Comics, which later changed its name to DC, but I understand that National Comics has a book called The Justice League, and it's selling very well. I want you to come up with a team of superheroes. Let's do something like that. So it's my responsibility to come up with such a team. I dreamed up the Fantastic Four and I wrote a brief outline. And at that time, I gave that to Jack Kirby, who did a wonderful job on it. With the Hulk, the X-Men, Iron Man, I wanted to use Jack for everything, but I couldn't because he was just one guy. So with Iron Man, I gave that script to Don Heck after I came up with the idea. With Daredevil, I gave that to Bill Everett. I think with Iron Man, I still wanted Jack to do the cover, though, for it. With Spider-Man, that was kind of an interesting thing. I thought Spider-Man would be a good strip, so I wanted Jack to do it. And I gave it to him, and I said, Jack, now you always draw these characters so heroically, but I don't want this guy to be too heroic looking. He's kind of a nebbishy guy. Would you call him a nerd today? I would say so, yeah. Anyway, Jack, who glamorizes everything, even though he tried to nerd him up, the guy still looked a bit too heroic for me. So I said, all right, forget it, Jack. I'll give it to somebody else. Jack didn't care. He had so much to do. Who did you give it to? I gave it to Steve Ditko. His style was really more what Spider-Man should have been. So Steve did the Spider-Man thing, although, again, I think I had Jack sketch out a cover for it because I always had a lot of confidence in Jack's covers. When the covers were done, were they done before or after the actual work was created? I don't think there was a hard and fast rule for that. I really can't remember. I think you would have to have done some of the work first, so in doing the cover, you knew what the characters look like. And did you take a particular interest in the cover? Oh, that was my specialty. The covers in those days, the covers were the most important thing, because we didn't have fans the way you do now. Today, fans go to the bookstore. Did the latest Fantastic Four come in yet? In those days, we sold according to how attractive a book looked on the newsstand. A kid would walk in the newsstand, and whatever caught his eye, he'd pick up. So we made sure, and this was something that my publisher, Martin Goodman, he was an expert in. He taught me a lot about what to do with the cover to make it stand out, what kind of color schemes to use, and so forth. So I paid a lot of attention to the covers. They were very important. And you would make changes in the covers. Oh, sure. And you mentioned that you had thought that Kirby actually did the cover on Spider-Man. What was the cover that he did? Was it based on an original drawing, or was it based on what Ditko had done? Oh, it would have been based on, I think, on what Ditko did, because it would have had to look like Spider-Man, the nerdy Spider-Man. I would think so. Well, as Spider-Man, he didn't look nerdy. He looked nerdy as Peter Parker, yeah. Fair enough. Now, you mentioned that you would have meetings from time to time, I guess plotting conferences. Do you recall, and let me we'll mark actually two documents, although they're related, an article that was written by a man named Nat Friedland in the New York Herald Tribune, dated January 9th, 1966. Do you recall the article? I'm going to show you copies of it. Let's mark this as Lee 3 and Lee 4. Stan Lee. I hate that article. Okay. I'm only going to ask you about one part of it. In the reprint, there's a reference, and I will just read it into the record that it says right. The plotting conference at the end of this article was for FF number 55. FF would be Fantastic Four. Right. Number 55, and issued just after the most prolific period of a new character creation on the series. I want you to take a look at the end of this article. Either one. Yeah, that's the one. And specifically, there is a paragraph that begins right there. Mr. Lee pointing. That starts. Quote, Lee arrives at his plots in this sort of ESP sessions with the artist. He inserts a dialogue after the picture layout comes in, and then it goes on. Here he is in action at a weekly Friday morning summit meeting with Jack King Kirby, a veteran comic book artist, a man who created many of the visions of your childhood and mine. Then it goes on for the next several paragraphs just to describe the plotting conference, and you can just take a quick look at that. I want to just ask you whether, in fact, this is consistent with your recollection of how typically plotting conferences would be. would go back in this period in the 1960s? Well, pretty much, except this is written by someone who I don't know why, but he just had taken a very unfair dislike to Jack, and it is so derogatory. It's just terrible the way he pictured Jack in this article. I can't tell you how badly I felt. At any rate, this is the way the conferences went. Very often Jack would say more than just, he might contribute something, or he might say, Stan, let's also do this or do that. I mean, we had conversations. But aside from that, yes, we would get together. I would tell Jack the main idea that I wanted, and then he would talk about it, and we'd come up with something. And that was a fairly typical example of how a plotting conference would go. Yeah, in that sense, yeah. Now, during the time that you've been testifying about, did Marvel ever buy work that was created by one of the writers or freelancers on spec, as opposed to having the material being part of an assignment that you would give him? Not that I remember. Excuse me. They may have made deals I don't know about. I'm just asking. Well, but nothing that I remember, right? In your recollection, right? Having been there all of that period of time, right? Now, when you would give out an assignment, how did that work? Did you give them deadlines? How did they... every strip had a deadline because these books had to go out every month. And it was very important that the deadline be met. Because if a book was late, we had already paid the printer for that press time. And if the book wasn't delivered in time, we still had to pay the printer. So it was a total loss to us. So the deadlines were very important, and the writers always knew this had to be delivered by thus and such a date. Now, in connection with the way that artists and freelancers were paid, did they get paid whether or not a particular book or comic was successful? Oh, sure. They were paid before the book went on sale. We didn't know how successful a book would be. They were paid when they delivered the artwork. Did you ever have any discussions with Mr. Goodman about what his investment and his risk was in context of being a publisher? Yeah, once in a while. I remember there was one time some artists had won an increase in their page rate, and they felt they weren't getting paid enough, and Martin was pretty gloomy mood that day. He said to me, what they don't realize the risk I'm taking, because if the books don't sell, I lose a lot of money. And I have no guarantee the books will sell. And we have periods of month after month after month where I'm losing money where the books don't sell. But I don't cut their rate. I don't fire them. I try to keep as much going as possible. And he gave me this whole thing from the publisher's point of view. And did you understand that point of view? Well, yeah, I could understand it from his point of view. I could understand it, yes. Just to add to that, he said he was the fella taking all the risk. That's the thing that he stressed. Let me go back to the covers for a second. Now, who typically designed the covers for the comic books? How did that process work? I usually, almost always, would say that I wanted the cover to be. Sometimes I make a little thumbnail sketch. I'm no great artist, but I would just indicate where I wanted the character. Because as I said, we considered the covers the most important part of the book. And I was very careful about the covers. And I would say that the illustration should be, I would say what the illustration should be, where I wanted the caption, where I wanted the blurb, how I wanted, whether I wanted a close-up or a long shot, whether I wanted it to be an action scene or just a dramatic scene, that I spent a lot of time on that. And after you give direction, were the covers done before or after the pencils were completed? It could have been either way. And did you ever reject a cover and ask him to go back and redo it? Oh, sure. Now, you mentioned also the practice was to pay writers, artists, and other inkers and so forth on a per-page basis, and they had different rates and so forth. During the period of time that you were there, were writers or artists did they ever get royalties from Marvel for the work that they did, or was it just per page? While I was there, I don't remember any royalties. We were discussing a number of different items, generally about the process that you oversaw as editor back in the 50s and 60s. And now I want to focus specifically on issues relating to Jack Kirby. You are aware that this is a dispute about the Kirby heirs. Nods head up and down. You've got to say yes on the record. Yes. When did you meet Jack Kirby? Well, the first day I came to work at Timely Comics, which was in 1939 or 40. And over the course of the years, what was your relationship with Mr. Kirby? Well, on my part, it was very cordial. I was a big fan of his from the beginning. Now, I'm going to focus on the period of time at issue in the 50s, the late 50s, and early 60s. At which point in time did Mr. Kirby come back to Marvel or Timely? I don't remember the year, but there was a time that he left and he did some work for DC Comics. Then he came back, yes. And by the late 1950s, he had returned. Late 1950s, 60s. Let me rephrase the question. By 1960, he was back working at Marvel in that general area. Maybe he left 2 times. Maybe he left in the 50s, and that's what you're referring to. He was back by 60. Right. That may be, because I know there was a time later in 60 they left and he came back, I think. Now, focusing on the period when he was at Marvel in the 60s, what was Jack Kirby's role at Marvel? The same as it had always been. Wait a minute, did you say the 50s? No, focusing on the 60s. As far as I know, the same as it had always been. He was our top artist, and I gave him what I thought were our most important projects. And what were his job responsibilities as an artist? Well, to draw the strip as well and as excitingly and grippingly as possible, and draw it in such a way that the readers would want to see more, and more. And who had the right to direct and supervise Mr. Kirby's work? That was me. And who had the ability to edit and control Kirby's work? That was my job. And who decided which comic books and characters Kirby would draw? I did. And who gave him those assignments? I did. As best you can recall, did Mr. Kirby ever submit work to you or to Marvel that he had done on spec? Not that I remember. And you mentioned the situation with taking him off the Spider-Man book. In addition to that, were there other instances where you did edit Kirby's work? Well, I edited everybody's work. I don't remember taking him off anything else. Do you remember Mr. Kirby ever refusing to make any of the edits or changes that you made? As a matter of fact, no. Jack was really great to work with. To your knowledge, during this period in the 60s, was Kirby working only for Marvel, or was he working for other comic books? I thought he was working just for us. Now, typically, what was the work product after you had given Kirby an assignment? What was the work product that you would receive back from Jack Kirby? I would receive back usually, if the book was 20 pages long, I'd receive back 20 beautifully drawn pages in pencil which told a story. And did Mr. Kirby ever suggest dialogue? Not orally, but what he would do when I would give Jack a rough idea for what the story would be. And he went home and he drew it in his own way, laying it out how he thought would be best. He would put in the borders, the margins of the pages, and he would put little notes so I would understand what he was getting at with each drawing. And he would sometimes put in dialogue suggestions also. Lee Exhibit 5, mark for identification. Let me show you what I'm going to mark, as I believe it's Lee 5, a magazine titled Jack Kirby Collection number 54, and I just want to point out some portions of that. Mr. Toberoff says, "Can I have a copy, please?" Mr. Quinn, I'm sorry. Mr. Toberoff, thank you. We tagged a particular section that has a blue tag on it. You can open to that, see the little... Oh, yes. And it's page 59 of this exhibit. And on the top, it talks about being fantastic penciling and the size. It says, what would a Lee and Kirby issue be without the Fantastic Four being heavily represented? And then it has a representation, I guess, of the penciling or the drawing done by Kirby in the first instance. Do you recognize the notes around the pages? Yeah, well, that would be Jack's handwriting. That's the way he wrote them, yes. And could you tell us, for example, in this instance, I see that there's a dialogue that actually is different in the different blocks. Tell us who did that dialogue. How was the process done? Well, I wrote the dialogue in the captions, but Jack would give me notes. For example, in panel 4 of that page, the next to the last panel, right? Jack wrote what he suggested the dialogue might be. Quote, I will rule. My years underground will end. Unquote. That was to let me know what he felt the fellows should be doing or saying. So I wrote, quote, my conquest will be complete. I, the mole man, banished from my fellow men half a lifetime ago, will return at last as the master of the earth. Unquote. Very often I would write dialogue to fill up the spaces. In other words, I also indicated where the dialogue balloons and the captions should go in the artwork. I might not have written so much if he had made the face bigger, but inasmuch as there was that space in the upper right-hand part of the page, I put in more dialogue to sort of dress up balance the panel with the picture and the dialogue. That was something else I had mentioned, but I concentrated very much on. So, for example, in the panel above it, that panel was an interesting panel. I only used 3 lines of caption. I didn't want to crowd that with copy. And the same with the first panel. There's so much going on that I only had a 2-line caption that only went part way across because I wanted the reader to enjoy looking at Jack's artwork with no interference. And who was it who decided where the dialogue would go? I did. I always made the indications for the letterer. Before giving my strips to the letterer, I always indicated exactly in pencil after I typed out the dialogue where the dialogue should go in the panel, and the sound effects also. And this was a typical way in which you would work with Mr. Kirby? With all the artists, yeah. And who had the final say with regard to what was going to be written in those panels? Well, I was the editor. I did. And so just looking at some of the other panels let's go to the next page on the top in the second panel. Read me what Kirby had written in. Let me see if I can make it out. Quote, as it leaves his hands, the staff's power blows and rocks. Unquote. Something back. Quote, I can't make out the word. Right. And what did you substitute for this? Well, I thought it was so self-explanatory, and design-wise, I felt a big sound effect would be good. So I lettered in the word Batum phonetic for the letterer. I did it in pencil so the letterer would follow it, and I tried to make it a part of the design of the panel. Now, as part of the way that you worked with Mr. Kirby and the assignments you gave, did you ever ask Mr. Kirby to create new characters? Or did he ever create new characters in the context of the work and the assignment you gave him? Well, in the context of the work, I would give him the outline for the story. I might add that as we went on, and we have been working together for years, the outlines I gave him were skimpier and skimpier. I might say something like, in this story, let's have Dr. Doom kidnap Sue Storm, and the Fantastic Four has to go out and rescue them. And in the end, Dr. Doom does this and that might have been all I would tell him for a 20-page story. Dr. Doom? Dr. Doom being the villain. The villain. This guy doesn't seem to have any clue about comics. And Jack would just put in all the details and everything. And then I enjoyed that. It was like doing a crossword puzzle. I get the panels back and I would have to put in the dialogue and make it all tie together. So we worked well together for many years. But I'm sorry, I forgot what your question was. No. Whether during that period of time was it part of his job to create new characters from time to time. That's why I mentioned that. Because I might give him a very skimpy outline, like let Dr. Doom kidnap Sue. Now, when he drew the strip, he might introduce a lot of characters that he came up with in the story. He might have decided that Dr. Doom should send some giant robot to get Sue Storm. and he would make up the robot. And there might be some other people. Sure, Jack would often introduce a lot of new characters into the stories, and that was part of what his assignment was. Yeah. And did other artists do the same thing? Yes. To your recollection, were there any characters that Kirby had created before he was working with you, or anyone at Marvel that he brought to Marvel and then were published by Marvel? Stan Lee. No, I don't believe so. I don't recall any. Oh, wait a minute. Captain America, for God's sakes. He and Joe Simon had created Captain America. Right. Now, by the 60s, Jack came to work for us. There was no more Captain America. We weren't publishing it because Martin Goodman thought it was a World War II character and people wouldn't be interested in it anymore. I've always loved the character. So I decided to bring it back. I tried to write a story where he had been frozen in a glacier for years, and they found him, and he came back to life and so forth. And I tried to give him some personality where he always felt, well, he was an anachronism. He was living in our day, and yet he had the values of a 20 or 30 years ago. And I tried to make him a little bit more interesting. And Jack would draw him, and Jack just drew him beautifully. And the stories worked out so well that he became part of the Marvel superhero characters, and the one that I did not create. Yeah, and he's a great character. They'll be making movies of him soon. Other than Captain America, you can't remember any? No, I don't remember any others. To your knowledge, did Mr. Kirby ever shop a character around to other publishers before bringing it to Marvel? Not that I know of. Did you ever have any discussions with Mr. Kirby as to who owned the rights to particular characters? No, again, not that I can recall. Was it your understanding that Mr. Kirby was aware of Marvel's policy that everything was work for hire? I took it for granted. We never had even discussed it. Did you hear my objection? No, I didn't. Sorry. Leading. Thank you. To your knowledge, did Mr. Kirby ever try to use a storyline or a character that he and you created together for Marvel when he left Marvel and went to DC or someplace else? Did he take any stories we had done and use? Not that I know of. Now, we talked generally about how the freelancers were paid. How was Mr. Kirby paid? When he brought in, like everybody else, brought in his work, he'd bring in artwork, he'd hand in a voucher. We had a prepared voucher forms, and I would, of course, okay the voucher, and he would go to the bookkeeping department. Based on the number of pages? Yeah, so much per page. To your knowledge, did Mr. Kirby ever receive any royalties from Marvel? Did he receive royalties? Yes, royalties from Marvel. I don't know. Now, you indicated that Kirby had left and come back to Marvel at several different periods of time. To your knowledge, when Mr. Kirby was working for other comic book publishers, did he do some of his own writing? I think so. I didn't really follow it, but I think he worked, when he worked for DC, they may have written some of the characters he created, but I don't know for sure. Do you know whether after he left Marvel, his characters had the same kind of success that the characters came about during the period of time when he was at Marvel? Well, I don't think they became as successful as Marvel heroes, no. I want to focus specifically on the creation of a number of specific characters that we talked about several, but I want to go into them in a little bit more detail. Now let's start with the Fantastic Four. You actually referenced them earlier. Tell me about the best you recall. How did the idea for the Fantastic Four come about? And who were they, and what was the backstory with regard to the Fantastic Four? Well, as I had mentioned, Martin Goodman asked me to create a group of heroes because he found out that National Comics had a group that was selling well. So I went home and I thought about it, and I wanted to make these different than the average comic book heroes. I didn't want them to have a secret identity, and I wanted to make it as realistic as possible. Instead of living in Gotham City or Metropolis, I felt like we'd have them live in New York City, and instead of the obligatory teenager, Johnny Storm driving a whiz-bang V8, he would drive a Chevy Corvette. I wanted everything real, and I wanted the relationship to be real. Instead of a girl who didn't know that the hero was really a superhero, not only did she know who he was, but they were engaged to be married, and she also had a superpower. So, things like that. And I thought I would try that. So I wrote up a very brief synopsis about that. Naturally, I called Jack because he was our best artist, and I asked him if he would do it. He seemed to like the idea. He took the synopsis and he drew the story and put in his own touches, which were brilliant. And it worked out beautifully. Books sold, and that was the start of the Marvel success, you might say. Excelsior. Okay, Stan didn't say that. I did. Okay, I am going to end part 1 of Stan Lee's testimony right there. It's been almost an hour of reading, and it's much harder than reading a script because people are talking off the cuff, and there are a lot of syntax errors, shall we say. Anyway, it's very clear from this that Mr. Quinn, on behalf of Marvel, is establishing that Kirby was well aware that he was doing work for hire, and Stan was as well, and that Kirby did not create these characters on his own. It is established that Joe Simon and Jack Kirby created Captain America, and Stan rewrote his origin to bring him into the Silver Age, but there is no clarification as to why Cap is not one of the characters the Kirby estate is attempting to claim. Ultimately, whether you agree with Marvel's lawyers and the ethics of work for hire, it is fairly clear that Kirby and all the freelancers, which also includes Stan Lee in his capacity as a writer, went into their contracts eyes wide open, and a trenchant point is made that at no point did Kirby attempt to take any of his so-called Marvel creations to DC nor to any other publisher. Of course, that may be for obvious legal reasons, but nevertheless, there were not any rumbles from Kirby about him being the sole creator of any of these characters. There was the insinuation by Mr. Quinn that when Kirby went to DC and began writing and creating his own characters, such as the New Gods, Commandy, the Demon, etc., that none were ever remotely as popular as those that he worked with Stan Lee. That is an assertion that I'm sure will infuriate the Kirby faithful for whatever the reasons are. It is undeniably factual. So here at the end of part 1, we end with Stan Lee saying that this was the beginning of the Marvel Age. So that makes for a tempting setup for part 2, which I hope will be the final part. That's it for now. Please leave a like, a comment, no matter how acidic, and feel free to subscribe, because I just learned that 91% of the people that listen or watch my YouTube channel are not subscribers. 91%. Ouch. Anyway, thanks very much for watching and for listening, and I will see you next time with part 2.